So this morning we're continuing our series from the book of Habakkuk, the prophet Habakkuk in the Old Testament. And we've entitled this series, Strong Faith for Confusing Times. And we are discovering as we walk our way through this book that the events that were happening in 600 BC or thereabouts sound very much like the times in which all of us are living. We've moved through chapter 1. Last week, from chapter 2, we focused in on one verse, and we connected it with a verse in Romans chapter 1, the just shall live by faith, and what it means to live by faith, reminding us that even in confusing times, in difficult times, we still have a responsibility to have a strong faith and to live by our faith and trust in God. So this morning we could have read, in fact, the entire chapter 2 because it's part of what we want to talk about this morning. And then next week, the Lord willing, we'll be wrapping up with Habakkuk's prayer that is found in chapter 3, and it's a very wonderful prayer. But before we get to that, we need to talk about what's going on in Habakkuk 2. Now, you'll remember in this book that we've told you these 3 chapters, about 54 verses or so, are a little bit unique and unusual as related to other books in the Old Testament. And that is that the book of Habakkuk, 3 chapters, is simply an exchange between one man, the prophet, and God. So Habakkuk is literally writing out, if you will, his conversation that he had with God and what God's conversation was back to him about the things that Habakkuk was concerned about. So we have this interesting, if you will, sort of a dialogue book. We're listening in on a two-sided conversation. And in chapter 1, we began with the complaint that Habakkuk had. He was really complaining about what was going on in the world, okay? And why God wasn't going to do something about it. Well, the reply that Habakkuk got was not the reply that he anticipated. And so we have that, obviously, in chapter 1. Well, after the reply that Habakkuk received that he didn't really like, Habakkuk had a second complaint. So he was responding again back to God as if he were trying to convince God to change his mind. And then, of course, we move into chapter 2, and we have again a reply from God, and that's where we tackled the one verse where God simply says, the just shall live by faith. And so that's what we have literally in chapter 2 is the Lord's reply. This entire chapter, with the exception of verse 1, is literally God's reply to Habakkuk. And it focuses around what I want to call this morning choices. Just one word, choices. And in your worship folder, you'll find a little note sheet that has some blanks with the main points of where we want to go this morning, but you can sort of fill in anything that's of interest to you. So let's talk about Habakkuk 2, and we've read just only 4 or 5 verses this morning from Habakkuk 2, but we'll be sort of focusing in on the entire chapter. So you'll want to have your Bibles in front of you if you want to follow along, because we're going to back up just a little bit. But this chapter 2 has to do with choices. And it's a reply from God. And we're going to understand why it is that this chapter speaks to us about choices. Now, all of us have heard many times, we've heard it said that our choices matter. How many of you believe that our choices matter? How you choose matters in life. And we know that our choices matter because all of life is shaped by the choices that we make, isn't it? Think about the choices that you've made in your life up to this moment and think about how those choices have shaped your life. And what I'd like to observe this morning is that we make our choices, and our choices turn around and make us. Would you agree with that? We make our choices, and our choices have a way of making us. Now, at age 62, I would submit to you that I've come to believe that I am little more than the sum total of all the choices I have made over all the years of my life. In other words, the reason I'm here today with you is because of choices throughout my entire journey that have led me to this moment. Now, you know as well as I do that not all of us always make the right choices in life. How many of you agree that we don't always get our choices right? Anybody ever made a bad decision in your life? Anybody ever done that? Okay. Now, please don't look at your husband or wife this morning and think that that's your bad decision, okay? That's not where we are. Although some of us admittedly have struggled in relationships and maybe it didn't always work out like we had anticipated. But really deeper than that, we all know how important our choices are. And they're very crucial in our lives. They're obviously critically important because, as I said, our choices will make us. They either help us in our journey or they can hinder or hurt us in our journey. And because our choices matter, we know that the Bible speaks of our choices often. Do you remember that Moses told his people when he was leading the people Israel, he told them to choose life, didn't he? They had choices always before them. In fact, when they were going through the wilderness wanderings, it seems like probably every day Moses was trying to direct traffic with them and get them to answer the choices that they had and get them to answer right. Now, you know, once in a while, Moses, the leader, even made some wrong choices. Do you remember that when they were in the wilderness and Moses was commanded to speak to a rock, and that was the rock that was going to provide sustenance, Moses ended up sort of disobeying, and he ended up striking a rock, and God had other plans in mind. There were all kinds of decisions. In fact, the decisions that the children of Israel made dictated how the rest of their journey went. We also know that Joshua called the people to make choices. He was a successor to Moses. And you remember, one of the choices that he called them to make was how they were going to serve the Lord, who they were going to choose. And we remember the familiar verse about, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You know, choose you this day who you're going to serve, but I'm going to serve the Lord. Do you remember the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and everything that was going on there and how Elijah was being mocked? And remember the mockers said, well, you know, if your God's the God, let him call down fire from heaven. And Elijah ended up talking about, if the Lord is God, then follow him. If Baal is God, you follow him. And there was a choice that they had to make. And if you study the book of Psalms, there are Psalms all the way through that talk about making choices and the importance of making choices. The book of Proverbs has a lot of verses around that as well. And most of us remember the classic statement that Jesus made about choices. He talked about there's two ways. There's a wide way and there's a narrow way. There's a wide gate and a narrow gate. And all of us make a choice as to which way in life that we're going to go. In fact, Jesus said, I am the way, I am the truth, and the life. And when Jesus makes that statement, he assumes that we're going to make a choice about that, aren't we? We're going to choose whether he in fact is the way, or we're going to choose truth versus error, or we're going to choose life versus death. So every day we make choices. In fact, You had to make a choice to get up this morning, didn't you? How many of you found that choice really easy? You were just so ready to get up out of bed and head to church. Anybody? You made choices as simple as, did you get your teeth brushed? Did you get your hair combed? I don't have to make that choice very often on mornings, but did you clean up? Can you think of all the myriads of choices we make every day? Some of them are pretty incidental, as much as like, should I turn the light on or should I not? And some choices that we make don't impact our lives quite as much as other choices, do they? Some choices don't seem to make any difference, but I want to submit to you that I actually think every choice we make makes a difference. I mean, you choose which side of the road you're going to drive on. That makes a difference, doesn't it? You choose the speed you're going to follow. That makes a difference. You choose which door you're going to go into. Now, sometimes those choices are being made for us during the pandemic. They tell us which door to go in, right? I started into Walmart the other day in Altoona. I parked my car on the side of the entry where I thought I'd be closest because I didn't want to walk as far, and I got up there and it goes exit only. So I had to walk clear the other way, And then I realized after I'd walked all the other way, I didn't look at all 4 doors. It was only on 2 doors. I could have walked in the other 2. A little confusing. But yeah, literally, we make choices, and I think sometimes we don't even understand the impact that those choices have on us. Because every one of us here today is on a journey of either life or death. And so our choices really do matter. We tell our children their choices matter. And we had a little example this morning. Choices matter. Even in a presidential election, choices have consequences, don't they? How you choose can dictate so many things in your life. And so it seems like a really simple lesson, but it's never more important. Choices are never more important than when hard time comes and life seems to move against us. That's when choices get really difficult, when life is hard or things are really oppositional to us or things are confusing around us. I would submit to you that that's not the time we need to be checking out. That's the time when we need to focus in and really think about the choices that we make. Because I think that when we are in confusing times, when we are in chaotic times, and we are, as was Habakkuk, hence we have a book named by the prophet, because we are in these chaotic times, because we are in these confusing times, I believe that choices matter, because it's in these kinds of times when you find out very quickly what you really believe. Like, what's really important to you? And whatever is really important to you is going to dictate the kind of choices that you make. Would you agree with me? If it's important to you, you're going to think about it. Hopefully you're going to pray about it. Hopefully you're going to be discerning about it. And that's exactly what is happening to Habakkuk in chapter 2. He is finding out now, as he listens to God, he's finding out what he really believes. God is bringing him right now in this chapter, at this point, God is bringing him face to face with the choice that he's going to have to make. In light of the fact that God isn't going to get rid of the Babylonians right now. God's going to allow the Babylonians to do their horrific, evil deeds against the people of Judah. God is allowing that. And Habakkuk, even though he's pleaded with God, he understands, okay, this is what's going to happen. Now God says, because this is what's going to happen, Habakkuk, you have a choice to make. And as we pick up the story in Habakkuk 2, here is the prophet waiting for an answer. And God tells him there's 3 things you need to do. First of all, in verse 2, we go clear back to verse 2, God says you need to write. You need to write. W-R-I-T-E. Here's what he says. God says, write my answer plainly on tablets so that a runner can carry the correct message to others. I love the way God explains himself. The Living Bible gives a paraphrase, and I like what it says. Listen to this. Write my answer on a billboard, large and clear, so that anyone can read it at a glance and rush to tell the others. God wants to make his will clear. And what he says to Habakkuk is not some secret coded message that only certain people can decipher with some Bible translation code. God gives him a clear message, and it's a message for the whole nation. In fact, he says, I want you to write this down like it's on a big billboard, so anybody who comes by has no question about what I've said. I want you to write, okay? And obviously, Habakkuk did, because we have these words of God and these words of the prophet. The next thing that God said, I want you to do, not only write, but I want you to wait. Now look at verse 3. This vision is for a future time. It describes the end, and it will be fulfilled. If it seems slow in coming, wait patiently, for it will surely take place. It will not be delayed. God is saying, look, not everything I've told you is going to happen now, but it will be fulfilled. God, to us, may seem slow, but we know this: God is never delayed. He never delays in order to hurt us. God is always an on-time God. I heard someone say one time, God's clock keeps perfect time. I submit to you right now, if I asked every one of you what time it is, we would all have a different time on our timepieces, wouldn't we? Now, some of you might say it's time for you to quit, Pastor, but I'd be asking for the time, and we would all have some discrepancy of time. The fact is, when God is talking about time, his clock is always perfect. He's always on time with everything he does. Have you ever noticed how when you're praying for something really big in your life, the answer seems to take forever to come? Anybody ever notice that? Why does it happen like that? There's a lot of answers, but chief among them is this: God will not share his glory with anyone. He answers in his own time and in his own way, so that when God does answer, we can say this: that answer is not about me, that's about God. God gets the glory. And God is saying to Habakkuk, not today, not tomorrow, but the answer is on the way. Hold on, wait for it. And he even says it will certainly come. There's no doubt that there's an answer that's going to come, Habakkuk. It will certainly come. The Babylonians, God says, someday will be judged. And in the end, God says, someday they will be destroyed. God says, someday I'll balance the scales of justice. And we're reminded that God doesn't work on our timetable. Though God seems to linger, he does not delay. And remember, the next time you feel like giving up when you pray because you're not getting an answer, that's the time when you need to be more intense about it, because God is going to reveal in his own time. So write and wait. And then I love this one. Remember. God says, in the midst of this rampage of terror in these confusing times, you need to remember. And we mentioned that last week. In verse 4, God says, here's what you need to remember. You need to live by faith. You need to live by faith. When they're killing you, you need to live by faith. When the enemy destroys your home, you need to live by faith. When your loved ones are taken into captivity, you need to live by faith. And so that's what God is telling us. When we look around us and we see what's going on, we have to know in whom we believe. We have to know our focus. We have to know who is our hope. We have to keep living by faith that God in His time is going to bring all things to their rightful conclusion. Now, once we get past verse 4, we get into a whole series of what we call woes. God says, here's how I'm going to cut down Babylon. This empire is going to be brought down. It's going to be destroyed. And in verses 6, 9, 12, 15, and 19, 3 of those verses we read this morning, at least 2 of those verses, God gives us some woes. He gives a formal indictment against Babylon. See if it doesn't sound much like our day. Verses 6 through 8, there's the woe of extortion. When the Babylonians captured a city, they plundered its silver and gold. They took all the crops, they took all the cattle, and anything of value, they carried it off, so that they actually grew rich by creating misery in the life of others. But God promised a day of judgment. They got away with it for a long time because nobody dared to stand against them. But God saw it all, and in due time God said, I'm gonna even the scales of justice. Does that sound like anything in our day? Getting rich through the misery of others. And then there's this arrogance, verses 9 to 11. The woe against arrogance. Now, these verses in 9 through 11 are talking about walls, building big houses, okay? And the stones in the walls that cry out against you, and that's in verse 11. So understand that the walls of Babylon, in some places, the ancient city of Babylon, the walls were 100 feet high. And they stretched 40 miles around the city. The Babylonians thought they were invulnerable to attack. They didn't believe any army could breach their fortification. And many years later, remember in the book of Daniel, Belshazzar, the last king of Babylon, would give a grand banquet that turned into a drunken orgy that was interrupted by the sight of a finger writing on a wall. God said, you've been weighed in the balances and you're found wanting. Babylon was found wanting, and the kingdom, God said, will be taken from you. It's going to be divided between what we know now as the Medes and the Persians. And that very night, the king died and the kingdom collapsed and mighty Babylon was no more. It took a while for God's justice to prevail. But their arrogant spirit, their arrogance, God commanded a woe against them. Do you think that's anything like our times? Is there any arrogance going on around us? And it's a confusing time. And then there's bloodshed. Well, verses 12 through 14, we read a little bit of that this morning. Just bloodshed. You can imagine the bloodshed that happened. And think about the bloodshed that happens in our country. Let me just offer you, what do you think God thinks about 60 million babies killed in America through legal abortion since 1973? What do you think God thinks about that bloodshed? And now we have leaders in our culture who are saying that it's okay to kill a baby after it's been born. When it's born, at the moment, the mother can make a decision whether or not they want to kill it. The last time I checked, that was infanticide. That was killing of live babies. And in New York State, legislators laughed at anybody who would even oppose such an idea. What is wrong? Bloodshed. Immorality. Do I need to talk about immorality? Verse 15. Look, Your neighbors are going to get drunk. You're going to force your cup on them, and you're going to gloat over their shameful nakedness. Immorality. Immorality. The woe against immorality. And think about our culture. Wouldn't you say our culture is full of immorality? Full of vices? And then, of course, verse 19 speaks of the fifth woe, idolatry. Verse 19 says, "What sorrow awaits you who say to wooden idols, wake up and save us." God says, you really believe that you can ask an idol of wood or stone to wake up and save you from what's going to happen to you? Do you really believe that? Think about idolatry. The things that people worship. Anything that comes before God is an idol to you and to me. Anything that we place of more importance than God can become and will be an idol to us. The woe of idolatry. Well, how many of you ever heard the expression that we're on the wrong side of history, about being on the wrong side of history? And especially when it comes to the way we have redefined what God speaks about in His Word. We don't want to be on the wrong side of history. There's a lot of people that don't want to be seen as a narrow-minded bigot, or people who don't want to be singled out for ridicule because you stand for something that is so antagonistic to the culture, or you call out something from the pulpit that people are afraid to speak to. And what we need to remember is that history is really His, H-I-S, story. History is really the story of God. It's how God is working through people like you and me. And what I want to submit to you, I don't want to be on the wrong side of His story. I want to be on the right side of history. And the right side of history is always to be on God's side. And you don't determine the side of history by the latest Gallup poll or the latest decree from the Supreme Court. That doesn't always put us on the right side of history. And so, if you line up with the cultural forces of today, you're going to find yourself out of step with God tomorrow. In fact, that's the point of Habakkuk 2. Habakkuk, if you line up with any of these woes, if you line up with any of this, you're going to be on the wrong side. And so Habakkuk had a choice to make like we do. Are you going to be on Team Babylon? We heard the story. Are you going to be on Team Jesus? I want to submit to you that right now, when we look around, it seems like Team Babylon is winning the big game. They control the media. They control the entertainment industry. They control the major universities. They control the halls of power. Team Babylon holds sway over contemporary culture. And Christians are drawn to the lights and the sounds and the bling that goes with being on Team Babylon. And there's a lot of people that are switching sides. They're getting on Team Babylon's side. Totally antagonistic to God. And what we got to remember, that in this game, the only score that matters is the final score. And that score has already been predetermined by God. And we want to be on the winning side. How many of you want to be on the winning side? I want to be on the winning side. And that's to choose Team Jesus. Did any of you remember the song, "This Is My Father's World"? We sing it, but maybe we don't really think about it. There's a verse in "This Is My Father's World" that says this: "This is my Father's world. Oh, let me ne'er forget that though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is" what? "The ruler yet. This is my Father's world. The battle is not done." How many of you agree with that? Jesus, who died, shall be satisfied, and earth and heaven shall be one. That means God is going to bring everything to completion. So we have a choice to make. Let's be on the right side. And let's make the choice, as Joshua said of old, as for me and my house, what? We will serve the Lord. That's the choice we make today. In the name of Jesus, amen.